Okay, so we are live then. Perfect.
We are live. I'm waiting for YouTube to go live. It takes usually a couple minutes before we go live on YouTube. Okay, we are live on YouTube.
Yeah, it does say live on here. Okay.
Okay, fine. So, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to my channel, Cloud and Coffee with Navnit. We are here with yet another podcast, and in this podcast, we are looking to talk about building the data foundation for the GenAI, which is the backbone for your GenAI application. And today I have my esteemed guests joining. I will let them introduce. Ken, let's start with you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kian Pham. I'm the principal solution architect working here at Amazon Web Services, AWS. I'm the new guest on Navnit's channel. Nice. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for coming here. Shrikant?
Hey guys, good afternoon. My name is Srikant Sopirala. I'm the Principal Analytics and AI Specialist Solutions Architect. I've been at AWS for about 6 years, over 20 plus years of experience in analytics and AI. And with the advent of Gen AI, currently focused on helping a lot of customers build their data foundations for generative AI. So nice to be on this chat.
Harsha.
Hey everybody, I'm Harsha Tadiparthi and I'm the Principal Analytics and GenAI Specialist Solutions Architect and been with AWS for 6 years and prior to that broad decade plus experience on data and a little bit of machine learning over the years, but then last 1.5 years a lot on GenAI. It's nice to be on your show, Navneet.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, if you're joining, if you have a questions, put your questions over chat. We will be monitoring the LinkedIn. We will be monitoring the YouTube. So we are live on LinkedIn as well as on YouTube. So feel free to put your chat there. Other is all the opinion expressed in this podcast, though we have a guest from different organizations which we are representing ourselves. We do not represent our employees. So all the opinion expressed in this podcast by me or by the guest are personal and do not represent our employer. So we go with that disclaimer, right? So hope you all able to see my screen here, right? And that has something called data foundation for the Gen AI. So when we talk about the data foundation for the Gen AI, we are just not talking about bringing the diverse data set from the different data sources, whether it's the structure, semi-structure, or unstructured. We are just not talking about having those data being wrangled so you can able to use for your Gen AI model. We are talking about all the frameworks, which is all the pillars which is required for this framework. Whether you're looking to bring the data, when you're looking to bring the data, to analyzing how you're looking to bring the data, whether you will be looking to do batch ingestion, we are looking to do the real-time ingestions. One time, how you're looking to wrangle your data, whether what all validation you are performing, what all data quality check you are doing, and thereafter when you will be going and start working on the GenAI application, you will be going and selecting your knowledge bases, right? So there are multiple vector data stores are available within the space. How you will be selecting your knowledge bases, where you are, right? And that journey that we can going to discuss. And then once you will be start building your GenAI application, the more importantly, how you looking to optimize your GenAI applications, as well as how you're looking to put the security, compliance, and governance around the GenAI application. And nowadays, there's a term very popular around the GenAI is responsible AI. How you able to use that within your when you're building your GenAI application. So this podcast is going to be full of all the excitement around this topic. So hopefully, you will be getting to learn a lot. And again, this space is evolving. We all learning from our customers. We all learning from each others. So love to hear your thoughts around. If you have any, just put on a LinkedIn or on YouTube. So let's get started with our guest. So I will, maybe I can ask the first questions. We can start with Shrikant, right? So Shrikant, help me understand the role of a data in the Gen AI space when you will be looking to build your Gen AI application. When you trying to select the data in very first place, what all things you should be considering?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So if you think about it in terms of the data, for generative AI, there are multiple angles. One is, we talk about structured data, we talk about semi-structured data, we talk about unstructured data. So you obviously want to have all of these data curated. That way you can build that proper data foundation. Of course, there are different techniques. We will talk about it more. But in general, building a data foundation is, as you mentioned in that pictorial that you just shared, getting all of this data together, working together with this data and building that data foundation is fundamentally important.
Perfect. So when we bring the data together, right? Especially there's a term, very famous term, the garbage in, garbage out, right? The
Mhm.
way your data you're looking to bring, the way the output of your model will be. So can help me understand, like what's the role of having the data quality in very first place itself, like even before you bring the data, like having the data quality put into that perspective, how you will be going and designing your data quality when you're looking to bring your data.
Yeah, that's a fundamental, I think, question, right? So ensuring the proper data quality and reliability of this data is of every type of the data source is very important, right? For example, let's take structured data, right? How do you make sure that the quality of data is right? I mean, the way our customers are doing it is basically establishing proper governance, policies and procedures, right? And they're also trying to implement rigorous data validation, cleansing, identifying and addressing issues like missing values, duplicates, and also monitor these sources and audit these sources to get the data, right? That's one way of doing it in terms of structured data. And then when it comes to in semi-structured data, I think the one thing that we see with a lot of customers is they're making sure the data ingestion and the transformation pipelines, they have this they are able to sustain the variability and complexity of these semi-structured data sources, right? And then of course implement data validation, implement schema enforcement at the right places, and also utilize certain approaches like a schema on read or NoSQL databases. So these are very important for semi-structured data when it comes to data quality. And then when it comes to unstructured data, and that's one place I think people are struggling, right? Labeling the right data sources, annotating the processes or enhance the quality of the data is very, very important, because now we are talking about text and images and audio and things like that, right? So advanced data processing techniques, right, which include NLP, the natural language processing, computer vision, we have to kind of do and then extract the right and standardize the unstructured data. That is more complicated. But of course, you also have to monitor and then pre-process this data set. So data quality becomes a really, really important, because as you said, garbage in, garbage out. So applying these qualities, applying this data quality across these various data sources is very, very important.
Interesting. So Harsha, I can move to you there. So been talking, and we are in the space where we do this hyper personalization, right? And the personalization is in every data point. Like if you go into the web application, you will be seeing that is being personalized or hyper personalized for very specific. And when we talk about the hyper personalization, then we talk around bringing the data in a real time. So if someone is bringing the data in a real time, especially for the GenAI application, what will be your recommendation? How they will be building that pipeline in the very first place itself?
So to be honest, in the lot of variety of use cases that I have supported, the use of real time for generative AI is a very small use case so far. And the reason is it's challenging. It's very challenging because if you think about the way the models are supposedly to perform for a real time analytics type use case for generative AI, there's a lot in between which is primarily to do with the response times. You take a model, and the model is probably small or large. You find it will get there eventually, but the data that you bring in has to go through certain set of guidelines, access controls, and scrubbing, whatnot, and a lot of that is. And then you need to again make sure that it's represented in the right way for Gen AI. So that's fairly the reason. But from that very small set of that use case, the one that stands out is to leveraging a caching. And caching is, for example, you may be familiar with Redis. And enterprise Redis is something that has a what's called a vector caching engine embedded within the caching engine itself. So what happens is when you get a request, and let's say it's a prompt, and that natural language as you interpret that happens right within the caching engine itself. So it does check for the available data that's already cached, and if not, it's actually going to fetch it from the vector store. And the ingestion pipeline also falls within that same space, because if you're getting the new data, now you need to make sure if that new data is supposedly be in the hot tier or warm tier, and make sure that the data pipeline is set up in such a way that you're having that evaluation set for to check the temperature and then move the data accordingly. So the pipeline differs between streaming the data all the way into a vector store versus actually streaming that data back into the caching engine itself, because for real time the response time is of super importance, and it's something still being what I'd say is matured. I think that would be a right way to say it.
Perfect, perfect. So when we talk about the Gen AI, right, we're talking about at scale. Anything which we do with the Gen AI is being happen at scale, especially when you still put your system in a production. So Kane, let me come to you. So if I have to build Gen AI at scale, and I'm talking around here is primarily more around bringing the data at scale and having the data being ingest, ingested and integrated at scale. What will be your recommendation on how customers are doing it?
Got it. Yeah. So I would say, treat Gen AI, application just like any traditional application that you would have built, right? Like think about auto scaling, think about, monitoring observability metrics, right? Think about your KPI, right? What are your metrics? So a lot of time, think about the user experience as well, right? Like what are your target latency? So a lot of time, right? Let's say it's a chatbot use case. You don't want to wait for 30 seconds to get a response, right, from your chatbot. So think about scaling that, right? So yeah, it all came down to data as well, right? Do you have a lot of data that you need to pre-process ahead of time, right? Like like Harsha mentioned, right, the real-time use case, right? Like how fast can we crunch those data real time? So think about those as well. um
Okay.
the Yeah, go ahead.
No, no, go ahead. Continue.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Got it. Yeah. So I'm just trying to think. Yeah, a lot of use case here is, yeah. So think through those, and then design your architecture to handle it, right? So for example, a lot of your user might have the same type questions, same type similar prompt, right? Like, hey, I need help right now. Can someone help me? For example, then maybe you can actually cache it, right? So there's a term called semantic caching, right? So instead of cache a key value, you actually cache the phrase, right? So semantic. um, so things like that, or prompt caching, right? Like a lot of time, when you send a message or a request to a model, right? You actually don't have to resending the entire context to the model again, right? Those actually help speed it up. So there's a lot of technique in terms of that, right? We can, yeah, spend more time, deep dive into that as well. But
Yeah,
those are
yeah.
kind of the basics.
We can certainly go on when we're talking around optimizing the Gen AI. We make and talk around those one. So here we were primarily more on discussing more around the data sources. So now, and again, right, if you are a regular viewer of my show, if I try to divide these shows into multiple sections. So hopefully, you can get a better structure when you were watching this. So we are done with our first section where we had learned around data sources or how you can perform the data ingestion and integration. Now we are moving towards the other important section is the data wrangling. And if you are in AI ML space, data wrangling is where most of that ML people, most of those data, sorry, most of the ML engineers spend their time. They spend like almost 70 to 80% time just to do a data wrangling process. And in the data wrangling process, I have included one more tab here is the cataloging of the data, right? That goes means on top of the data sources. But I thought like maybe I can put here on this data wrangling. So maybe I can go with the Shrikant. So Shrikant, you've been in big data space so long, right? So help me understand what this cataloging process is and why this process is even play a vital role in the GenAI as well.
So let me understand the question. So is it cataloging for generative AI?
Cataloging your diverse data set. So now we've been brought the data from different data sources. How
Yes.
cataloging will helpful in for you to build your GenAI application.
Absolutely. So, I mean, think about it, right? Because generative AI is new for us, maybe a year and a half. Okay. In terms of, we have been struggling with generally a cataloging, even structured data sets, right? Because most companies are now trying to even discover their data and trying to understand what data set they have, even for structured data. So, I think we've implemented some services. We came up with some new, I mean, in AWS, we have some services which we can catalog. When it comes to unstructured data, that is more and more complicated, right? Because cataloging unstructured data becomes really challenging, and that is where I think most of our customers are struggling, right? The what we are trying to do is build these enhancements into our services where let's say you have an object storage of S3 and you have a bunch of documents and PDFs. How do you catalog that data, right? I mean, that's important. And also, not just cataloging the data, can you catalog the vector embeddings that are coming out of the unstructured data? So there are certain things that we want to look at, right? Cataloging is fundamentally important because you need to know, you need to discover, you need to find your data sets. Number two, unstructured data and semi-structured data, that also cataloging is important because when we feed those models into generative AI, we want to make sure that they have the right catalog and you can find your data sources pretty quickly.
Perfect, perfect. So when we talk about data wrangling, right? Harshad, do you have like customer built, and again, right, I'm just coming as in AWS. I'm wearing that AWS hat now, but again, as I said, like this is our personal opinion. There are various tools and techniques are available to perform data wrangling. Do you mind kind of exposing a couple of tools and procedures for our viewers?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, when you think of getting a good starting point to build your generative AI application, or so we call the best practices for building a RAG application. And RAG is a retrieval augmented method, which is essentially using a vector store at the back end in your ingestion process. And first that comes to mind is you have a lot of data, which is, whatever the size is, right? It's unstructured, it could be PDFs, it could be text documents, etc. You'd want to be able to first do a good chunking. There are different types of chunking strategies. You could do a character-based chunking. If you're retrieving based on sentence, you could do sentence-based chunking. Otherwise, paragraph, whatnot. And always the best practice is to use your consumption pattern. So if your users of the system are going to ask questions more on sentence based, they're more semantically relevant, then you basically use the chunking strategy of that. And then
So
the
help.
chunking size is
Um,
important. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry for interruption, Asha. Help me
Yeah.
understand what this chunking is all about in the GenAI space.
Yeah, so think of a document, let's say a PDF document, and that PDF document has 10 pages. And the way the retrieval in the retrieval augmented generation works is you ingest that document not as a single one file, and I'll tell you what happens if you do that. If you look at a vector database at the back end, the database has, primarily two capabilities that are super important. One is the dimensionality, and I'll talk about what that dimensionality means, and how it's important in your overall building of the application wrangling use case. And the second is the type of the chunking that you do, and the size of that chunks. And why is it important is when a search happens, let's say you ingested the data as a single document, and when you try to retrieve that, what will happen is all of that data, which is that entire document, has to come back from the backend vector store to the model, and the model only has so much context window, and it'll have a lot of what do you call unwanted information, because you're basically sending it as a single document. So when it tries to fetch, let's say it's an auto manual, then you ask any question, you get the sort of that full manual, right? Which is not really something very refined, and you lose the right context. Rather, you divide that document into 50 smaller chunks, and when you search, there could be, for a specific question, only three of those chunks are relevant. So you get a smaller size to work with, which is more efficient for the large language model, which works off of a limited context, right? Throwing garbage in, you get garbage out. So you try not to do that by only giving relevant, important information, and that's the whole concept of why that chunking is important.
Interesting. So when you have mentioned a couple of interesting terms around vector databases, chunkings, and RAG and all, uh, we're definitely going to go deep on those one. But help, Ken, I'm coming to you on those one. When we do the data wrangling, like we used to do the data wrangling on our traditional AML, right? Now we do the data wrangling for the Gen AI, right? How you draw the kind of how you compare them, or are there, and how you contrast them? Like are the same process, or there are something different you should be doing when you will be doing the data wrangling for the Gen AI?
Yeah. So Gen AI, a lot of time when you interact with the application, a lot of time it actually show you the sources where the data came from, right? So one of the things, yeah, Harsha just talked about chunking. It's very important to remember where that small chunk came from, right? For example, so in that concept, right, you want to save some of the metadata. So for example, if you go to a website, right, and then download that, you might want to retain like the URL and the title of that web page, right? So when you retrieve that chunk, you know where they came from. Uh, so that way you have like the contact when you retrieve it, right? Same thing with your internal data, right? You know what sources it came from. Does it came from S3? Does it came from your Aurora database, for example, right? And internal wiki, right? What page it came from. Um, so that will affect your kind of your output, right? The I think in terms of processing it, the pipeline, right, it's still similar. So yeah, Harsha talked about chunking, different chunking strategy, right? Sometimes you want to do semantic chunking. Sometimes you just like randomly cut at a fixed size, right? So like I don't care, just cut it randomly every 200 tokens, cut it, right? Or sometimes you want to do semantically, like let's say you have a JSON document, right? You don't want them to cut in the middle of a JSON structure, right? Because the second chunk might not hit enough context, right, when you query for it. So those are some of the things to think about as you chunk your document.
Yeah. So what I learn is like when you will be going and doing the data wrangling, what you used to do is dropping all the null values or dropping unwanted value, etc. One thing which you should be keeping in mind is how you're looking to chunk your data. And as Harsha has mentioned, chunking is kind of dividing your big documents into in small pieces so it can get stored into your vector and then have the vector representation. That's a good segue for us to actually go into the Gen AI space now. Till now, we were more around the data space. So let's go into a next step where we're talking around the knowledge bases, right? So Shrikant, help me understand, because all to our guests talking a lot around this vector store. They talked around the chunking, tokens, etc., and everything is coming under this knowledge base. So help me understand what is this knowledge base is all about.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So you have it here. So I mean, think of knowledge base as a fundamental repository for when you're implementing Gen AI applications, you want a component of central repository where your structured information, where your context, where your logic, all of that sits. So in general, is a knowledge base is not just a bunch of information, but a dynamic system, right? That is interacting with the AI models, enhancing the decision making, and also storing the quality and relevance and accuracy of the content. So knowledge bases in the Gen AI world becomes an important aspect of it. It is so in layman terms what it is basically a structured, well organized repo of information to support your search and your inference and reasoning for generative AI. Of course, it has many components, right? We can talk about vector embeddings. We talked about rules and guardrails. We will talk about agents. All of these components make these knowledge base. So that is the definition, at least in my mind, of what a knowledge base is.
Perfect, perfect. So when we select, maybe I can come to Harsha. When we talk around the knowledge base, one very specific component comes into is vector data store, right? That's play a very crucial role when you're building your GenAI application. And when we talk like vector store within the market, and especially when we talk around the AWS space, we are having vector store being built on OpenSearch. We are having the vector store built on Kindra. We are having the vector store built on Pinecone. We are having the vector store built on uh, PG vector, right? So there are multiple options available within the vector store. So how customers should decide where they should be or what kind of vector store they should be using?
I think first maybe let's define what vector stores. Harsha, maybe you can talk about what vector stores are and why are they important, and then we'll talk about how to apply them.
Yeah. So basically, before I mention about what a vector search is or semantic search is, I want to spend 2 minutes about what a lexical search, which is the keyword search. So let's say you take a keyword and you're searching for, let's say there's a doctor's prescriptions that are in your search repository, and from that prescription, you wanted to identify certain drugs, and then you want to ask certain patient names, whatever, right? And then first thing is the drug. So when you ask for the drug, that's a keyword. So you really want that search to match that term. So at the back end of the search store, they index based on individual keywords. So they basically use something called a k nearest neighbor, which keeps that closest matching terms together. So when you search for penicillin, then it will have that penicillin in its store index, so it can quickly fetch penicillin and that associated document back. Now that's specific to penicillin. Now what about your interests in drugs and genes and certain therapeutics that are in some way, shape, and form related, right? So in order for that search to work, a keyword search engine falls flat. So that's a lexical search engine. So what happens in a vector engine is, think of it as a multi-dimensional space. And in this multi-dimensional space, and this is where the dimensionality fits in, right? You have x and y axis, that's 2 dimensions. So you can easily plot, where your certain, a term is using 2-dimensional space. That's only 2 dimensions. You give an x-axis, you give a y-axis coordinate, and that's it. Now, in a multi-dimensional space, think of it as a very, circular, full different points in that space, you can now start representing with that pretty much like infinite number of coordinates, and that's ideally possible, but not on the engines so far. Engines have now limits of 15,000, 16,000, whatnot. We'll get into that. But the idea is here, I represent that different associated drugs, the therapeutics, a lot of those features will now go into the representation itself. So when I search for, not just a drug name, but the therapeutic, which could be, a disease name, then that automatically also brings in penicillin along with it. So that's the power of the vector search. And I lost the question.
The question was, so
No, that's
no,
yeah.
that's a good. So just for the viewers, like just put some context. Harsha went into very technical, so just for easy to understand. So let's say you are going and searching. So when we say like semantic search, like okay, are we taking the context? Say I like Apple. I'm talking about Apple as in product, or I'm talking about Apple as in Apple iPhone or a company, right? So was the notion behind my search, if your engine starts understanding that part, what you actually looking for, it able to provide better. So that's the semantic search we are talking here. But
Yeah.
Harsha, the question was like, okay, if we have so many options available within the AWS space,
The vector.
where the
Yeah,
customer is starting? Yeah.
No,
yeah, yeah.
I think also one thing to address is vector. I mean, why we need vector embeddings, right? Because I think maybe Harsha, you can touch on that. Like, why is it important? Like in the generative AI space, why do we keep talking about vector embeddings, right? And
Yeah.
then, yeah, let's explain that.
So high level, right? When you like explained earlier how that search works, and now that's not a regular plain text. You have a PDF document or a text document, which is natural English language text, but that's
Yeah.
not how the backend store is storing it. So something else in between needs to convert it into a vector representation before you can ingest that and then search it. So that's where the embedding models come into fore, and they convert that. So that's the whole purpose of the embedding
Yeah, I
model.
mean, the generative AI models don't understand text; they understand numericals, and then you vector embeddings are basically those text converting to new numbers, right? That's what vector embeddings are. Okay.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And
So now
then
it comes to identifying which vector store to choose for your use case. Um, Between several customer real world use case implementations that I've been a part of, oftentimes there's not a significant amount of difference at this point in time between all the POCs that have been happening. So the best guidance is to start with the one that you're very familiar with and start testing that out to your use case. And there are certain use cases where, especially when you have to go between large set of dimensionality, and the dimensionality is directly proportional to the quality of output. So dimensionality in the sense, you could have a document where there are 1500 different coordinates. Like I mentioned, x-axis, y-axis is two coordinates to represent one object. You can now have up to that 1500s, and there are engines that go up to 16,000 in that dimensionality. So it adds more overhead on the backend engine, the memory and performance. So there are so many things and costs, everything to be considerate of. But don't worry too much as you're starting off. Just pick the one with the language flexibility that you have. If you're a database person, go with the Postgres PG vector. If you're yeah, good.
yeah. So usually, what is when I talk to my customer, I say like, start with where your data is. So if your data is in OpenSearch, start with an OpenSearch. If your data is in Postgres, start with the PG vector, right? If you do not know, start with the Kindra. So the easiest option. So we've been talking around this vector store knowledge bases, right? There is a very interesting terms come, and when like I think there is a real concern around the Gen AI when we use it is, hey, this Gen AI, if it's not putting or exposing that some kind of a confidential information, when I'm training my data upon, And that's where this guardrails and agents comes into, or actually the guardrails comes into picture. And other is, I will be combining two questions together. Other is, there is a saying called 2024 is a year of rag, uh, and 2025 is going to be the year of agent. Help me understand these two concepts: what is guardrail and what is agent, and how this is useful in terms of GenAI.
Got it. So yeah, when you kind of like mashing all the data sources together into like one single vector database, you want to somehow be able to segment it in a certain retrieval, right? So for example, both me and you have the same access to an internal wiki, for example, right? But like certain page I cannot read, right? So what that means is uh, guardrail basically help you protect two things. So I usually explain guardrail like think of it like the WAF, right? Web application firewall, right? It protect your incoming application and whatever return. The same idea here is it protect from input attack, right? Prompt injections. So like one of the interesting use case work with customer is they have a chatbot, right? You type something and then you say respond in speak like a pirate, right? So that's bad, right? We don't want our production chatbot to speak like a pirate. So there's guardrail to help us to do not speak like a pirate, right? Speak like a real helpful human agent, right? So that's like one very simple kind of input protections, right? And then output, right? Like whatever return from the large language model, we also want to protect that, right? So for example, let's say we ingest our database, somehow it might contain the actual email, right? A lot of time we don't want to actually respond the actual email back to user, right? We want to redact it, right? For certain use case. So guardrail can actually help us protect the output coming from there. So that's kind of a very basic. You can do a lot of other stuff, right? Deny a certain topics, right? So let's say you're a chatbot and you're helping people. You don't want people to talk about election, or you don't want to, people talk about other company. So you can like deny those topics as well. Um, in terms of agent, so a lot of time like these large language model, train on massive data set, but you also want to enhance it, right? Like kind of you want it to do something else, right? Think of it like an API or some type of plugin, right? That you want to enhance it, right? With your business objective. So for example, right, you want an agent to when customers say I'm not happy with this, you want maybe to create some type of call the internal API, create a coupon for them, for example, right, based on their sentiment being low. Uh, so agent can basically help you kind of take additional actions outside of these traditional large language model.
Perfect. So I think this is a great segue to move to our next section, is actually building the GenAI application, right? So we brought the data in, we processed the data, we have created this knowledge base, we put the guardrails there. Now we are having the agent helping there. Now we are moving towards building the GenAI application. So maybe I can start with the Shrikant. Shrikant, help me understand, if when I building the GenAI application, w- what all things I should be considering in to start with.
Yeah, I think we just talked about few of those things, right? I think most important, obviously, we want to be considerate about our data, right? A quality of data, like what you're feeding into these Gen AI applications. That's number one. And also cataloging the data, right? Cataloging the right data sets. That way you have the repositories available for your generative AI applications. Then we also talked about having the right knowledge base mechanisms, right? Right, choosing the right vector search depending on what you're comfortable with. Of course, we want to do that, and then also have a proper guardrail mechanism where you because the LLMs are pretty happy to hallucinate, and they provide all kinds of information. So having these guardrails, having those things probably built into your application is one other important thing. And then the other thing I also considered is, once you have this, have a monitoring and evaluation framework for these generative AI applications. That is fundamentally important because the most of these applications are built and then these are evolving constantly. So you need a mechanism where you need to monitor the metrics, you need to evaluate, make sure the responses are right. So that is the framework that you definitely want to build. So there are a lot of components. I mean, most of them we already talked about. knowledge bases, proper vector embedding, vector stores, agent framework, the guardrails and responsible AI framework, evaluating and monitoring frameworks. These are all the things that I would be considering looking into. And the other most important thing, which is generally not paid attention to, is the LLM ops, right? The large language model operationalizing, right? We are all interested in putting stuff in POC, but then when we want experimenting is great, but then when we need to move into production, we need to also understand how that framework looks like. So that's another a topic for another day. But I think large language model operationalization is another important aspect when you're building Gen AI applications.
Okay, I think you missed one very important point, but I will let other guests come into picture. So when you're building your GenAI application, what all things you should be considering? Maybe Kane, you have any thought behind it?
Um, yeah, so there's a lot. Yeah, so like I said, right, just treat it like traditional, production, system that you're gonna launch, right, workload. Um, I would say so far working with customer, right, like the two number one concern right now would be the performance of the model, right? Like, does it answer what I asked it to do, right? And then the latency, right? Does it make me wait for 10 seconds, right? A lot of time these are like real, if it's like real system interaction use case, right? User might not want to wait for your bot to respond, 10 seconds. So those are two things. And then a lot of things that can affect that, right? So like you keep optimizing, like, Sri can kind of touch on that, right? Like LM ops, like you change of fine tuning the prompt, it can change the entire output, right? So yeah, and then it can also change your security model, right? So like changing a certain thing can affect the output, can affect, the model being hallucinate. So evaluate the model, right? Pick the right model for the right use case, right? Sometimes you don't want like the best model, that like the most smart model, right? For certain use case, you only need something really fast, right? For that use case. So be able to, be flexible enough, right? To be able to swap model, choose, and optimize on that.
I think Navneet is quizzing all of us. The one important thing, Navneet, which I think I forgot to mention, of course, is the prompt engineering, right? I think that's another important component, a very important component. Of course, we will let Harsha talk about it, but prompt engineering
We'll go
is
on.
really
We go on the optimization. I already have an entire section around the optimization,
okay.
so
Perfect.
we cannot talk around it. So
Yep.
uh, I think the one most important thing which I feel like is even to go and identify the use case itself. Hey, is the use case itself is a GenAI use case that can be solved using the traditional
Okay.
approach? One I see here is in recently around is the personalization, right? Personalization can be done very it can be done in the traditional AI in a really good manner. You don't need to have a Gen AI to do the personalization in very first place itself, right? So
That's great.
identifying the use case is super critical.
It
Uh,
is. It
there
is.
is
Yeah.
a saying there is a saying called, right. Once you have a hammer, not everything is a nail. So let's move to different kind of a Gen AI application. Harsha, what all your customer working on? What all good help us to understand or give us example of without naming the customers. Good real use cases where customers are working around the Gen AI.
So, chatbots certainly for various different business segments could be something for call center associate type to help them with um, how to how to provide better um, options when, for example, let's say a customer is unhappy and the customer representative needs to provide certain options for them to ensure they retain that customer on that call. So at the back end, as the customer service agent is chatting, there's already a profile of the customer and a lot of the back end crunching that happens, and in response to those chat associate questions, like what do I need to offer? This customer is unhappy because this product has blah 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 such and such problems. Then the chatbot can provide certain suggestions based on the customer profile. Whether it's a gold level customer, provide certain $20 discount, whatever, right? Things like that. So it's a great use case that has seen itself in multiple different industries in different shapes and forms, but all falling under the chatbot type use case. The other use case is more like legal teams trying to audit on certain legal contracts and trying to ascertain certain information which is either explicitly mentioned in the contract or not, and there are large repositories of contracts, right? So that's another one that's coming forward. And then this third one, which I see a lot common across the organizations, actually two more I'll say, more common, are leveraging the enterprise resources or the enterprise internal repositories such as Confluent, where they put all their enterprise documents, or SharePoint, etc., right? And then using that data to provide insights into an internal chatbot or internal applications, if you will. So that's another. And finally, development, coding, trying to optimize developer experience through a chatbot or an AI experience to help them improve their efficiencies on code development. That's
Perfect. Perfect. So I believe everyone know nowadays what all GenAI applications are. Uh, so and everyone may be building something. Me use personally used to write all the LinkedIn post for
That's
for
cool. Yeah.
for GenAI. So let's move to one of the very critical aspect of the GenAI is optimizing the GenAI, because GenAI is not cheap, right? Definitely, it's not free for sure. So help me understand. We briefly talked about. Ken, I will be coming to you. We briefly talked around RAG, what this RAG is all about, and how it is helpful in terms of optimizing GenAI.
Okay. So a lot of time, right? These large language model (LLM), right? When they train on massive data set, but they have a knowledge cutoff, right? So, for example, if you pick a lot of model right now and you ask like who won the most medal in the Summer Olympic 2024, they might not know, right? Because they might train it like before that summer. So think about that, right? So that's one use case. Like you want to have these large language model get smarter, but using your own enterprise data, right? So a lot of customer, that's exactly the use case, right? Yes, large language model is very smart, right? But I want them to answer using my company data, right? So for example, I think a lot of us have Slack, right? So like we have people asking a lot of questions on Slack, and we have like 3 years of history, how to do that, people onboarding. What would be great, right? To use those Slack messages as part of your knowledge base, right? So you can actually send those historical messages, save it to some type of rack solution, right? And then new employee came in, and even existing employee, they ask the same question, and then the large language model, right, with rack enhance can be able to answer those business, right? So those are the technique, right, with rack.
That's the RAG. So it's
Yeah,
more like training the large language model with a specific set of the data set, right? That's the RAG.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not training, it's basically enhancing your prompts with your own content so that the large language models don't hallucinate. Because large language models tend to hallucinate because they just provide answers, but you want to contain the hallucination. So what you want to do is you want to provide a proper context to these LLMs, and that is what RAG does. RAG basically takes your data, and then let's say you're trying to summarize something, right? It is taking your data as a seed or context and provides that to the LLM. So that way you don't get the hallucinated answers, you get more context based answers based on your own organization. Most customers are embracing RAG. Of course, there is other training options, but RAG is pretty popular across the board.
So you mentioned two things: prompt engineering. You mentioned RAG. So either I should be using prompt engineering, I should be using RAG, or I should be using both.
So, okay, I can touch that. So, RAG is an architectural approach where you are sending context to the proper context to your LLMs. prompt engineering is one of those things in the RAG, right? Basically, what you're doing is to, when you provide context, you provide prompt engineering, you provide prompts. Well, that is what prompt engineering is. It is, yeah, of course, prompt engineering has a lot of techniques on its own, but providing proper prompts is basically how good a prompt you can provide is the expectation that you get a good response is based on that. So prompt engineering is part of RAG's architecture. So that does it make sense?
It does make sense to me.
Yep.
So if you are starting with your optimizing the GenAI, you will be going into this prompt engineering first and see if that help you to solve or optimize your GenAI application. The next you will be going to the RAG if you have very specific data set. So
No, no,
Harsha,
okay. Let me just rephrase that. I think it's important.
okay,
If I didn't have RAG and I just have to ask a question to a generative AI LLM, right? An LLM. Basically, the way I do that is by sending it a prompt. That is what its prompts are. Prompts are
make
basically sending those things. But then the prompts you have to, that is how you send information input into an LLM. But RAG is with your own context, you provide prompts. That is what RAG is. Prompts, you have to do it, but you are basically sending it in context with your content or your organization content. That is what RAG does. Does it make sense?
got it. Makes
Yeah,
sense. Yes, definitely makes sense. So here in the prompt engineering, you will be giving an example, and then in RAG, you will be giving the entire data data set. If I have to say, right, that
right.
and it will be much more context, and then again you will be providing. So Harsha, what is this fine tuning then? How we in normal ML world we used to do this called hyper parameter tuning. Can we do within the GenAI space as well? And I have one more question for you is I've been hearing this term around top K, and then we are having this top value. What all those things are within the GenAI space?
Yeah, so basically, to answer the later question, right? Top P, top K, I'll answer that first. So when you ask a model a prompt, and that prompt is searching based on its own trained knowledge or the backend knowledge store using certain inference methodologies that it's been trained on, and it's now got a way that it finds n number of items that are relevant to your response. So top P, top K, I'll have to exactly figure out which one it is, and others on the phone can correct me. So the top P is going to provide the top, let's say there are 100 items, then or 100 words that it's predicted. So within that 100 words, it basically, if you put value as 10, then it's going to use only the 10 and provide that sentence that or the next, predict the next word using those 10. And then the top K you said, right?
Yes.
I'll have others mention it because it's been some time. I've looked
Yeah,
at.
yeah. I think of top K as a restrictive way of telling the model to basically send you some most likely tokens. Because what happens is these LLMs tend to send you a lot of nonsensical outputs when you ask questions. So top K is basically, think of it as limiting the outputs that it is generating in a certain manner, right? That's what top K sampling means, right? You can have hundreds of them coming back. You're saying that, okay, I need 5 or 10 more relevant outputs that are returned from you. That's what top case sampling means. Okay, that's why
Okay.
you provide a number 5 or 10. That way, because the more and more outputs you get, the more and more nonsensical they become. So that's what you're trying to prevent with top case.
Okay.
Yeah, it
Okay.
finds probability number. So that's why the top K is
P.
always 0 to 1, and you select that
Yeah.
number within that range.
Interesting to learn. So again, as I said, like there are others fine tuning approaches are there. We don't have a time to go on all of them. So as we are moving to our last section, I think, and this is super critical sections around the GenAI is the security, compliance, and governance for the GenAI. Uh, Kane, help me understand why this is important.
Yeah, I would say it is important, right? Anything you think about compliance security, for example, you don't want your company to be on the news, right? Like by answering something wrong or giving wrong advice, right? Like I think how should I explain like doctor and drugs, right? Like, hey, I need, what drug can help me with this issue, right? And then you answer something wrong. So it's very important to do that. Data security, right? Like you don't want to leak your internal data, right? With RAG, you are using your company internal data. So let's say you're building something externally, right? Somehow you don't want to expose that data. So there's a lot of potential, right, data leakages or the security issue that came up that we mentioned earlier with guardrail, right? It can potentially protect some of that. Uh, but yeah, it's like you need that data governance, right, to control how data flow, who get access to what, right? Even internal app, right? You want to kind of keep that same consistent, ACL access control list because each user have different permission to access a certain data. So if they are interact via Gen AI now, they probably still need to carry that same ACL over. So those are some of the stuff to watch out for.
Perfect, perfect. Shrikant, when we were discussing earlier, you had mentioned something around responsible AI, and we had been hearing these terms over internet a lot. What is responsible AI and how this play role within the Gen AI space?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things that come to mind to me, right? When it comes to responsible AI, one of the key things with this model development is bias and fairness, right? What generative AI models, what they will do is they have a lot of societal bias based on the data that have been trained on. So what we are trying to do is protect everybody. So addressing bias and fairness is very crucial because what we are trying to do is that way it's not harmful and we are not creating these marginalizable, vulnerable populations. And then we are not creating these stereotypes in these. So that is very, very important. So that's what responsible AI. Being fair, being non-biased, and when we build these models is very, very critical for that, right? That's one aspect. The other aspect is explainability and transparency. That's another key thing that I keep hearing on responsible AI, meaning because the generative AI models in general are pretty opaque, right? They're very opaque. What I mean by that is, the decision making process, how they're built, that is pretty opaque. And then, so understanding and enhancing the explainability and transparency of these Gen AI systems, having those model providers provide what type of data these build on, how do we enable this effective oversight on these models is very, very important. And that's also responsible AI in my mind. So fairness and bias, explainability and transparency, these are the two things that I think are responsible. And then, of course, there are guardrails. We can add all of that stuff too, also to responsible AI. But those two things that come to mind.
That's interesting because that's very interesting take because those Gen AI model is trained on open corpus of data, and the marginal groups always are underrepresented in terms of how they put into what all data they're able to put on internet.
That's
So
right.
that's very 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 interesting take. So I think that should be considered. So Harsha, let's come to one of those aspects like okay, the governance. I know Ken has just talked about how you can able to put access control around it. So one aspect is putting the access control. What else we can put? What else things come as part of the governance within the Gen AI space?
Yeah, making sure you're protecting your data privacy, such as PII data or PHI data, or if there are any certain, if it's images, then sensitive images need to be, scrubbed. Those are that related to that data privacy. Other things are like identifying the intellectual property related content within your data repository that you're exposing to your users, making sure you validated that within your organization. And that's why the RAG application is more and more important because that's your trusted repository. And then we talked about the toxicity and safety, which is to do more with guardrails and ensuring that you have certain, limits and scoping of how you're responding to certain or taking input as well as responding both. You can apply guardrails at the input to the model as well as at the output. So that way you're scrubbing that information that you do not desire.
Perfect, perfect. So I think we are our end of our session. So I will go round robin. Maybe I can start with the Kane. So Kane, what will be your last take around if if you have to suggest how you can build the data foundation for GenAI? Maybe if you can summarize in just 1 minute.
Got it. So I would say yes. Think about your use case, right? What data do you need to build this, Gen AI application, right? Is it solving use case, right? And then I would say at Amazon we love to work backward, right? So work backward on your use case, like the target, like what are the target you're trying to achieve, right? What are the target latency? What are the target performance, right? Think through those, right? As you design your architecture, so that will help you, achieve that target end goal. Do a lot of
Perfect,
testing as well, right? A lot of these Gen AI just require a lot of internal testing, do a lot of evaluations, I would say.
perfect, perfect. Okay, Shrikant, to you.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I'm sure we all watched Spider-Man one of these days, right? With great power comes great responsibility. So generative AI is a very, very advanced system, right? So I think using that application, using that model architecture, in a proper manner to do that, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about governance. We talked about data foundation. We talked about security and compliance. So following all of these important principles when you build generative AI application is fundamental. Of course, it's great power, but we have to use it responsibly. Again, having the right fairness and right bias, right? Taking all of that into consideration, I think is important when you build these applications.
Perfect. Rishabh, your last comment.
Yeah, I'd say make sure you have a robust evaluation system to evaluate your entire RAG pipeline. Me and a couple of my colleagues have actually built an end-to-end RAG pipeline evaluation framework with code that can be reused. And now that you can share that after the fact to your subscribers. And that helps you get eyes into the system, and from end to end you can start monitoring what's happening with your application.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So, what we have learned, or at least what we have discussed in this 1 hour, is when we talk about Gen AI, usually our customer starts here like, hey, this is really cool, shiny tool. Let's get and start build some kind of POC, and they get excited there. However, when they kind of mature in their journey, when they start taking much more steps there, then they realize the Gen AI is just not all the application. It has lot and lot of under the net, like how you can building your knowledge bases. In order for you to build the knowledge bases, how you build kind of doing the data wrangling. In order for you to do the data wrangling process, how what all data you need in very first place itself, that that tie to the what use case you're looking to solve. And most importantly, as we have highlighted, is how security, compliance, governance is play critical role, especially around the responsible AI, because the data or the Gen AI application is built on open data. It's trained on the open corpus, and most of the time those are biased in nature, as well as why to have an optimization in place is super critical, because this Gen AI is not cheap, right? Or it's not that economical. And don't forget to put, we have not discussed this governance around the data, because this is so much already been discussed. But having the right data governance process in place also super 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 critical for you to build a better Gen AI application. So with that, thanks to all my guests, and we'll see you guys in some other podcast. And to all like typical YouTuber, do like, subscribe, and share the channel. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Yep. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Bye, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye bye.